And so this is the S's. This is the S's on winning in 16. First of all, seriousness. I'm alarmed. I am worried. I think probably any one of you in this room with any kind of military background like Christine, or anyone who's got any kind of family members in the military like I do, realize that the long war is just getting longer. I had a fantastic opportunity on Friday to interview former CIA Deputy Director Mike Morrell. He's a figure of no little controversy because of the talking points controversy, but he is a great American. He served 33 years in the Central Intelligence Agency. He was the daily briefer for President Bush in the course of 2001. So he was with him on the most awful day in modern American history. And he's written this book, The Great War of Our Time, which, when you combine it with Lawrence Wright's The Looming Tower, provides you with a comprehensive history of 1946 to the present day, the country's engagement with Islamist fanaticism. And it's metastasizing. It's getting much, much worse. It's not getting better. We had achieved a certain stasis in Iraq in 2011 when we prematurely abandoned our job. And great powers do not get to lay down their burdens. They don't get to walk away, because into that gap comes evil. And Ramadi is today the scene of a near genocide. And it's going to get worse before it gets better. All the good news in the world in the last year: the Republicans' election in 2014, Likud election in Israel in March, David Cameron's astonishing victory last week in the United Kingdom. We have nothing to do with any of the good news. General al-Sisi's election as President al-Sisi, and I know he is not a paradigm of human rights by the Western standard, but he's a lot better than Mr. Morsi was, and he's effectively again cobbled together the cooperation of the allies of America, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Egypt and Israel, into a de facto alliance against both the Hydra that is the Islamic State and the existential menace that is Iran. Very serious period of time. In 1980, I graduated from college in '78, and I drove across the country, and I went to work in San Clemente, the Elba of America, for the exiled former President Richard Nixon. I spent some time with David Eisenhower first, but then I spent a year and a half with RN. After he had written the book, the memoir of RN, he wrote a book called The Real War. And he wrote that book for the campaign of 1980 because he thought it was necessary to focus the country on just how thoroughgoing and international had been the collapse of American influence in the world. And it was thoroughgoing and complete in 1980. There were Cubans, not at the Vatican, as they were this week, but all over Africa with guns. There were Soviets in Afghanistan. There was a revolution in Iran, that the consequences of which we continue to live with today. And Nixon thought it was very important in the run-up to 1980 that even in his crippled state, his disgraced state, that he do what he could to emphasize the seriousness of the times. And I think everyone in this room has got to do the same thing in every venue in which they appear, which is these are not the 90s. You know, we had our holiday from history, we had a great time, and we thought, as Francis Fukuyama wrote, that we were at the end of history and everybody would become Democrats. But that is in fact not the way it is, and it's worse than you could imagine. In the run-up to the UK election, which I follow obsessively, I love British politics, Theresa May, who was the Homeland Secretary and the head of MI5, repeatedly warned Londoners that the number of jihadi plots there are so large as to defy imagination. And in the United States, if you talk to anyone who is seriously connected with the effort, there are between 200 and 500 active jihadis who will act as they can. And in fact, at a number of military installations last week, the defense code went from A to B. Alpha to Bravo, I guess, which is unusual. They haven't done that in a long period of time because, again, of the use of the dark web, not the deep web. There's the surface web, Christine could tell you. There's the surface web, the deep web, and the dark web, and I didn't know what that meant. And there's a web down there deep, deep, where the Islamist radicals are working. The second S is specificity. I love specificity. Chris Christie gave a speech yesterday. I read the whole thing. And I am so undeclared. I absolutely have no dog in this fight. I'm doing at least one debate, probably two, maybe three. And I don't want anyone on that stage to believe that I walked in beforehand with an agenda to harm or bleed or other, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the debates at the end. other than do my job, which is to ask questions that will help Republican primary voters pick who they want to be their nominee. That's my job. And so that's, what a surprise, huh? I'm not going to ask George Stephanopoulos, should the states ban birth control, Mitt Romney? And, what in the world? But Chris Christie gave a speech yesterday. I don't mind complimenting it. It was so specific. He talked about how we are at a close to a 260 ship Navy. We're actually at 272, but a few of them are in port. And that we have to be at a 350 ship Navy. He talked about the number of carrier groups that we need. He talked about the A-10 and the F-35. He talked about whether or not we have to have the Super Hornet extended, the F-18A Super Hornet. He talked about our submarine fleet. He actually talked about getting the Marine Corps back to 185,000 people. That is the level of detail that I think the American people want from elected officials. I don't think they want the talking points. We're all so sick of talking points. Tell me what you really want to do. I was talking with Christine beforehand. I know what I don't know. I don't know anything about net neutrality, right? I know zero about net neutrality, and all I get are talking points. People are for it or they're against it, and no one ever sits down and explains to me, perhaps in like 3 minutes as Christine did, what it's about. And that's because there's a failure in American political discourse where we accept the 30 seconds as being the limit upon which we can talk. That's why I love talk radio. I get 3 hours a day. You didn't know we were doing a 3-hour speech this morning, did you? No, we're not. On the domestic side, what do we want to do on the tax side? Mike Lee came to there's some of you from Utah, Mike came to my studio a couple weeks ago, and we got into it, because he wants to get rid of the state income tax deduction. I said, you'll kill California. You'll just kill California. We're dying already, but Melissa knows, if you had a 13% non-deductibility, people will flee. They're already like refugees headed for Arizona, and that's why Doug Ducey was on the program yesterday. He was over bagging up our refugees, right? If it's not Rick Perry, it's Doug Ducey, and if it's not them, it's some other governor out there grabbing this and grabbing that and taking it away. The geography tax is enormous, but at least it's mitigated by a tax code that says 13.5%. And Paul Ryan says to me, that's your state's problem. I said, yeah, but there are reliance damages. There are estoppel damages if you build your life based upon a tax code, and then you change that tax code suddenly, you're doing a terrible thing. I had this argument with believe me, Paul Ryan is a great American. I respect his intellect. I respect the specificity and the seriousness with which he goes at it. But he wanted to change the retirement benefit program for veterans in the military of 20 years service. And he wanted to do it immediately for people who had 19 years of service and were about to retire, and 12 years of service and were about to retire. And I went to town on this, as did Lindsey Graham, with whom I very rarely agree. But the American people said, that is a terrible idea. But whatever we're going to do, lay it out. King versus Burr will be decided by the end of June. As far as I can tell, neither the House nor the Senate leadership has said what we will do thereafter. I think that is a mistake. I think the specificity, as for example, Arizona is approaching education reform next year. I would love to see by summertime a series of proposals put out there for people to actually kick around and kick the tires and talk, not have it unveiled. I understand the budget this year had to be unveiled because there was a crisis. But if you're going to do ed reform, put it out there and trust the people to have input that is serious and purposeful. Third thing, speed. Only the government moves as slow as the government moves. The pace of a radio show is 15 hours a week, 75 segments a week, 300 segments a month. We are constantly moving. I have 4 jobs. I'm constantly moving. I'm sure everybody in this room is the same way. Why does government move like molasses? Why is that? Why is it the only thing that simply refuses to advance important proposals early and get things done early? And it's because of a mindset that is deeply ingrained in a 19th century America at which travel was slow and ideas had to be allowed in an attempt to be dispersed and a public conversation about them had. And so that's where we got our tradition of extraordinarily slow Washington, D.C. And it's got to change because this world is not moving slow anymore. And to the extent that it is, we're going to ask to be overwhelmed by forces in the world which move fast. The reason that the Islamic State has taken over a third of Iraq is because it moves with lightning speed in directions that no one anticipated. That's why al-Shabaab is successful in its attacks on Kenya. That's why the Boko Haram is successful. That's why the Algerian Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb and Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, they move with lightning speed, and they have a decentralized command and control. In the meantime, we sit back here and we have our committee hearings and we do things, and then we adjourn for dinner and we come back in a couple of months. And it just makes me crazy. Fourth thing, sacred spaces. Now I bring this up because the same-sex marriage debate will be final as of June. It'll be over, one way or the other. States are either going to be allowed to have constitutional amendments defining marriage in the traditional sense, or they're not. And you and I have nothing to do with that. That will be Anthony Kennedy's decision. And so that's not exactly how the framers had it decided, but that's the way it's going to be. And when that comes down, however that comes down, we have to have a conversation about whether or not people are going to be allowed to believe what they want to believe without shunning. And shunning is a deeply disreputable approach that we've never really embraced in America. But if someone believes in a traditional Christian or other sexual morality or immorality, they ought to be allowed to believe that unmolested in their houses of worship and unput upon by the culture. And I think that 90% of Americans agree with 90% of this, but the 10% on both sides, my colleague Guy Benson, who I have trained up and brought up, announced casually last week he's a gay man. I've known that for a long time. And the hate mail that he got, we compared it. By far the most hate mail he got was from the left. He got some hate mail from the right. But it's unfortunate that anyone would send hate mail, but I just think that our culture's got to get beyond that because the barbarians are really at the gate. And we can't be allowing whatever the disposition of the answers are. We have to respect Americans' right to get along and endure each other and just agree to disagree. I've got the wackiest sister-in-law who I love. That's who my wife is in Venice with. She lives in Key West, and she's a liberal's liberal. I mean, we've had a rule for 33 years. We do not talk politics at dinner. We just don't. And I love her, and she's the de facto grandmother to my children, and she's a little bit older than my wife, and that's the way Americans ought to be with regards to these issues. It's not all drawing guns and shooting at each other. There are enough people on the outside of the world who are trying to kill us that we ought to be able to get along and have these discussions without attributing to other people malevolence. Second to the last thing I think about a winning conservative strategy, my last S, it's penultimate S really, penultimate for the benefit of the Steelers fans means second to last, is Spanish. Spanish. And Mike Kaufman is a congressman in Colorado. How many of you know Mike? Anyone from Colorado here? All right, so Mike knew he was going to be targeted by the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Married to Cynthia Carruthers, Cynthia Kaufman, who won the Attorney Generalship along with Adam Laxalt and Mark Brnovich, adding superb energy into the Republican Attorney General's Association. But Mike knew he was going to be targeted, and he knew that his district had been gerrymandered, so he did an amazing thing. He got Rosetta Stone, and he learned Spanish. Now that is, to me, what someone does when they really want to win in the United States. There are millions of legal American voters who consume most of their media in Spanish, in the way that Italian Americans used to consume their media in Italian, in the way that German Americans, my German-Irish Catholic family from northeastern Ohio, had lots of roots back in Bavaria, and there were German speakers in Ashtabula, and Niles, Ohio, which is near Melissa and I, Hubbard and Warren, is full of Italian Americans that still say capiche and speak in Italian. Well, there's a vast numbers of millions of legal Americans who speak in Spanish, and if we ignore that media, if we simply pretend it doesn't exist, we won't win another election. And we won't. Colorado wasn't close. We got blown out, and it wasn't cheating. I mean, it was close in Virginia, it was close in Florida, it was close in Ohio, but we got blown out in Colorado. And we got blown out in Colorado because we had no ground game in the Latino community and the Spanish-speaking community and on that area. So that's my last, but I want to follow up with something very practical. The sustained assault on Hillary. I mean, she was a horrible Secretary of State. Horrible. From the Russian reset button to the Libyan fiasco, to the Egyptian coup, counter-coup, counter-coup, to the alleged victory in Burma, which has led to the genocide of the Muslim people minority group in Burma, the fact that we have strained relations with all of our allies in Europe and a Ukraine that's falling apart. She's just a terrible Secretary of State. And that she organized a private server. I'm sure Christine can tell you this. What Carly Fiorina says is that everybody knows that that server was compromised. And Mike Morrell was on the show Friday and said, look, as a professional, you think the foreign intelligence services have her emails? He said, yep. Every one of them. And she did that with reckless disregard for the interests of the... We ought to be hammering her every single day the way that they hammered Romney every single day, at the same time that we come forward with a vision that is forward-looking and aggressive. They are ruined as a party, by the way, because of what's happened at the state level. People don't realize. You're building your bench, they got to build a bench. They don't have a bench for anyone to sit on. They've got nothing left. And you look around the Democratic Party, what President Obama has done to them is destroy any sense of vitality and future. They are really ancient, and they are out of gas. And all they can do is spend more money that we haven't got by taxing people who are already overtaxed and simply will leave. Capital is fluid. Capital will go where capital is welcome. There's a reason Apple has got billions and billions and billions of dollars sitting offshore. They can't repatriate the money. They can't use it here. They can build a new information center here, but they can't deploy their money where it's best deployed because of our tax system. We can change all that, and luckily the people in this room are going to be going about that. So I think it's going to be great fun. A last word about these debates. There are going to be 12 of them. And 9 of them are set up already, and then there will be 3 following the first 9, depending on how the calendar shakes out. And I don't think we ought to keep anybody off who has a plausible path to the presidency or a position of senior influence. I don't believe it's a number game. I wouldn't let Peter King on the stage. He has no plausible path to the presidency or a senior position. I would let Ben Carson on the stage. Ben Carson's polling at 14%. He has a plausible path to being the head of HHS. I suppose in an extraordinary circumstance he could be the nominee. I don't really think that, but first-timers shouldn't run for president generally, but he's an extraordinarily accomplished man of inspiring history. Carly's got to be on the stage. She is effectively our best weapon against Hillary. I just think we should have stadium seating. And I also think we ought to go 4 hours. People say, what, are you serious? I said, yeah, take a bathroom break at the top of every hour and then reconvene. And people watch the Super Bowl for 3.5 hours. My gosh, the Manny Pacquiao pre-fight thing went on for 6 hours. How many of you fell for that? I fell for that. I turned it on at 9. It was 1 o'clock in the morning when they started fighting back in the East. We can do that. The more we talk, the better we do. And provided that the moderators ask questions that are designed to help Republican primary voters select their best nominee. Not to trick them, not to trap them, not to bleed them, but to educate Republican primary voters on who they want to run.